So what I'm trying to do is to say, right, that this archaeological approach presumes some kind of fixed racial self, right, that we can retreat to that settles the moral complexity of our lives. And that seems to me wrong. But I don't want to rush to the notion or to the idea that black identity is no longer useful, that somehow it has little to do with how we orient ourselves in the world. Because the typical response to this view has been to deconstruct race, right? Claim that the notion is an arbitrary social construct. We heard that phrase in the introduction, right? And problematize the way we think about racial identity. Oh, you're just a human being. You're like, right? Oh, you're just like everybody else. And who's everybody else? White folks. Right? I know, yeah, some people say that's racist. No, it isn't. I'm just being funny, right? The typical response, so by now we've become familiar with some of the arguments that follow from such a position. We should focus on real forces like the operations of capital, right? And not on ideological notions like race. Or goods and services should be distributed on the basis of merit, not on the basis of racial identity. And perhaps the most widely held, that our belief in race is a necessary condition for the existence of racism, right? You've heard this argument, right? That our belief in race is a necessary condition for the existence of racism, and that getting rid of race language will help us end racism once and for all, right? As if race talk always singles out, right, the deficient, the pathological, in interesting sorts of ways, right? In short, in the admirable efforts to break loose from the stranglehold of bad ways of thinking about race and black identity, many critics simply swing the pendulum in the opposite direction and have never quite, at least to my mind, provided an adequate argument for such a drastic move. I would only suggest that to avoid this problem, some of the problematic consequences of this conclusion, we must realize that black identity has been and can be thought of in different ways, that our moral lives as black individuals are not reducible to one single explanatory principle, the racial self, and most importantly, that race language and racial identities are, at bottom, suggestions about the terms in which deliberations about particular moral questions are best conducted. Remember the Rorty quotation, right? So the pragmatic view of identity does not hold that identity is about discovery. Rather, identities are seen as consequences of human activity. More specifically, identities are the products of our actions as we struggle to resolve problematic situations, dispose of meddlesome circumstances, and surmount obstacles. Identity is not an archaeological project in which we uncover our true selves and infer from that what we must do. Instead, taken together, our problem-solving activity turns out to be our lives. In this view, character and conduct are interrelated and mutually dependent as we act in particular situations. Remember, the self is not some stable, unchanging, continuous frame of reference. Rather, it is thought of as an organization of habits that is relatively stable and enduring. These habits that are always subject to modification when we act constitute our character as it was formed, at least in part from previous experiences. Or as John Dewey writes, quote, character is the interpenetration of habits. I love that definition. Character is the interpenetration of habits. If each habit existed in an insulated compartment, right, and operated without affecting or being affected by others, character would not exist. As such, no self stands still, right? The country boy from Moss Point, Mississippi, right, is not the same man who's standing here, right? It is constantly, for better or worse, becoming, right? Sounds a lot like Emerson, or maybe Nietzsche, depending upon your temperament, right? No self stands still. It is constantly becoming. And, quote, it is in the quality of that becoming. It is in the quality of that becoming that virtue resides. end quote. Moreover, our understanding of the beliefs and choices and actions that rely on these habitual tendencies arises in the context of bringing those experiences to consciousness in narrative. The story of the self, the history that we tell of our formation. So what we've done and are doing and the stories we weave about those experiences are absolutely critical for a pragmatic view of Black identity. Now, I don't want, a good friend of mine, Tommy Shelby, he's at Harvard. Y'all all right? Just checking on you. Are y'all just being nice? Are you okay, for real? Okay. A good friend of mine, Tommy Shelby, I don't want to make the argument he makes in We Who Are Dark, right? I don't want to deny the relevance of this or centrality of Black identity to Black political struggle. I still think there's a role for it. Shelby argues for a position he calls pragmatic Black nationalism, which for him is this view that Black solidarity is merely a contingent strategy for creating freedom and social equality for Black folk, a pragmatic yet principled approach to achieve racial justice. But in making the argument, he rejects the standard claim that African American politics requires a notion of collective identity. He notes that such views often result in a reification of race and a conception of Black life that obscures relevant differences among Black folk and frustrates individual freedom. I'm not quite sure that Shelby takes seriously what a pragmatic view of Black identity might suggest. I think for him, the term pragmatic seems to have only heuristic value and not to refer to a set of philosophical commitments. We need not, in my view, discard identity talk as such. We simply should reconstruct the term in light of our pragmatic commitments. Shelby would have us believe that our identities are not so relevant to how we engage in struggles for justice, struggles for racial justice. But if identities are in fact the products of our efforts to overcome problems, then the content and consequences of our efforts impact the content of our character, right? The kinds of dispositions requisite for the kind of society both of us desire are in part formed in the context of political struggles. In other words, identities matter precisely because character and conduct are intimately interrelated and mutually dependent. What we do has everything to do with who we take ourselves to be. The problem then is with a certain view of collective identity, one in which Shelby puts forward and rightly distrusts. This view motivates political practices and justifies political choices on the basis, more often than not, of an already fixed conception of Black identity. But individual and collective identity, I believe, can be thought of differently. Black identities and the identities of those who struggle for racial justice are as much the products of principal struggle as they are the motivation for that struggle. Who we take ourselves to be, that is, how we understand ourselves as moral agents, often guides how we engage in politics and the sorts of choices we make, while engaging in politics fundamentally shape who we take ourselves to be. Identity talk matters then because of its ethical and moral implications for and beyond politics. Right? Now, Shelby also denies the moral philosopher Lawrence Thomas's claim that genuine cooperation among Black folk or African Americans, I'm bringing it home, requires a group narrative that is, quote, a set of stories which defines values and entirely positive goals, which specifies a set of fixed points of historical significance, and which defines a set of ennobling rituals to be regularly performed. These narratives enable forms of mutual trust that inform solidaristic efforts to secure freedom and justice, according to Thomas.